Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. Our event today is Taiwan's economic security, the role of transnational private enterprises. This event is generously funded by a grant provided by the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. So thank you again to TFD for providing funds for this wonderful event. My name is Emily Lee. I'm a program associate here at the Global Taiwan Institute, and I'm super excited to be your moderator for today's panel discussion. We have some excellent panelists to join us here for today, discussing a topic that isn't talked about a lot. So I'm looking forward to not only our audience participation and what our panelists have to say, but our discussion in general about this topic. So I'm really looking forward to it. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, if this is your first time to GTI, the Global Taiwan Institute is a 501c3 think tank dedicated to insightful and cutting-edge research on policy issues regarding Taiwan and the world. GTI's mission is to enhance the relationship between Taiwan and other countries, especially the United States, through policy research and programs that permit a better public understanding about Taiwan and its people. So to this end, GTI has a number of programs. We have a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief. We have 3 podcasts. We do public seminars just like this. So we highly recommend you check out our website, www.globaltaiwan.org, if you'd like to learn more about GTI. So as I mentioned, I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this discussion this afternoon to discuss Taiwan's private enterprises in a time of geoeconomic uncertainty. So despite operating in a vibrant, business-friendly environment, Taiwan's private enterprises are heavily impacted by cross-strait security risks, national interests, investor confidence, and interdependence within the global economy. So as more Taiwanese businesses are shifting their focus from China to other regions, it has become increasingly crucial to determine the implications of internationalizing Taiwan's economy, as well as potential broader impacts on economic security. So today's discussion will pretty much go as such. We'll allow first our panelists to provide some brief remarks. We'll conduct a moderated discussion, and then we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. So if you're watching online, you can also submit your questions either in the YouTube chat on the stream. You can tweet us at Global Taiwan, or you can email them to our email contact@globaltaiwan.org. So we look forward to everyone participating in this discussion. So I'd like to begin actually by starting with one of our panelists to provide some context with what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to start right here to my left. Catherine Tai is the Deputy Director for Asia of the Center for International Private Enterprise for SITE. She's responsible for overall program management, performance reporting, donor communication, and partnership management throughout Southeast Asia. This portfolio of projects focuses on partnering with business associations to strengthen the role of the private sector and mobilize local networks of small and medium enterprises for constructive policy reform. Previously, Kathy was a senior program officer for East Asia at the Eurasia Foundation, where she provided technical assistance to civil society groups and designed new initiatives with local partners. She has a master's degree in public policy from the University of Maryland College Park and a BA in diplomacy from National Zhengzhou University. As such, I'd like to turn to Catherine to maybe review some of the geopolitical factors at play when discussing national private enterprises, specifically in the context of this issue.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, GTI, for organizing this fantastic event. It's really a pleasure to be here. So as a native Taiwan, when I heard that invitation coming from GTI, it's really hard to say no. I have strong, deep ties with Taiwan, love my heart. And when it comes to economic security, this is an issue that SITE has been actually focusing on starting last year. So just a quick few words about SITE. SITE is an organization, we're an international affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so we are an NGO. Basically, we do a lot of projects that's demand-driven, it's partner-led. And so our goal really is to try to address and respond to private sector's needs and challenges, and then trying to help and empower the private sector to promote market-oriented reforms. That's really our mission. So how does the economic security really comes to kind of our view? Really, it's because of economic shocks. So for instance, the pandemic or, Ukraine-Russia war. So all of these economic shocks really could disrupt, not just the supply chain, but also, deprive people of employment opportunities, of, like any sort of a stable supply of goods. And so we are then paying more attention to this, but what really draw our attention to this topic is the strong demand and request from our partners from Europe, especially in the aftermath of the Lithuanian economic coercion incident. Next slide, please. So I already said a quick few words about SIPE, and then so next slide, please. So for years, China has played really the economic mind it has, and then it's leveraging its economic power to impose sanctions, economic sanctions, plays into people's fear of lost economic opportunities. So it's either countries or firms, because of the strong, really massive market that China has. And then so economic coercion has been a tactic that China has been deployed from Norway, in the incidents of Liu Xiaobo's case, to Australia, to Taiwan, to the Philippines. Really, the list goes on and on and on. And so in really 2021, when Lithuania established the Taiwan Representative Office, in China's import and export custom record, Lithuania as a country basically just disappeared overnight. But what's really shocking, not just this, it's really the use of secondary sanction through Germany. So because Lithuania exports a lot of automobile parts to Germany, and Germany relies China heavily as an export market, also as a manufacturing hub. So what happens is that the German companies that just couldn't clear custom in China. And so China used that as a leverage to pressure Lithuania to change its stance. And these sort of a secondary sanction tactic is what's shocked our partners in Central and Eastern Europe. And the reason for that is because a lot of times when we look at economic exposure of China, you look at the trade data, but the secondary sanction is not just, is not something that you can actually tell by the trade data that simple. So for instance, Germany and Central and Eastern Europe, so namely Slovakia, Czechia, Hungary, Poland, all these countries, they are very fully integrated with Germany when it comes to automobile industry. So these countries, their indirect exposure to China is actually 250 times higher than the trade data shows. So SIPE recently did a report with our partner, and then it shows exactly that. If you're interested in this report, I can certainly share the report with you after today's discussion. And so, can we go to next, please? And so, when it comes to economic coercion, it's also a very interesting trend from China is that if it's a good or a product that China can easily find substitute from, then China is less likely to select that good in its sanctions list. So for instance, oh no, sorry, previous one. So like Australian wine or pineapples from Taiwan, these are the ones that China can find alternatives or substitutes. So that's less likely to be sanctioned, to be on the sanctioned list. But then in the case of, say, iron ore from Australia or coal, so these are the things that China actually needs, then China will not put them into the sanctions list. So it really has a very sophisticated calculation domestically from the China side in terms of like what's being put on the sanctions list. And then the next one. And then so when it comes to economic dependency, really East Asia countries, so Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, we all know these are export-oriented economies. So from these charts, you can see Japan and Korea export 25% to China. So does Taiwan. Next slide, please. And so Taiwan's export to China is about 25%. It's pretty consistent. But if we add Hong Kong into it, it's about 40%. So that's something we need to change, right? So then we need to talk about how do we mitigate the risk? How do we reduce the economic dependencies? So usually two things. So next slide, please. So one is to diversify the export portfolio. So to ensure the reliance on single market, and also to allow a broader base of consumer base, and then to reduce vulnerability to supply chain disruption of specific markets. So the second one will be on import. So it will be import from a variety of different suppliers. Also is to ensure less disruption from supply chain shocks. And then also to make sure that there's a steady supply of goods for trade. And then again, to reduce dependence on import of single source of supplier. So policymakers around the world, especially East Asia, these export-led economies, have been really advancing risk mitigation strategies. So Taiwan, for instance, have been adopting two kind of national strategies. So I think my fellow panelists will talk a little bit more on that. One is reshoring, and then second is the southbound policy. So similarly in Japan, since 2019, Japanese government have been thinking about how they can reduce supply chain vulnerabilities. So then in 2022, Japanese government introduced the Economic Security Promotion Act. It's really a landmark legislation. This shows that Japanese government has been really taking the lead from its national security strategy and incorporated this into the whole economic system and in the trading portfolio. So they are thinking this holistically. So they're not just thinking about this topic from national security angle. They're really looking at it from all fronts. So Japanese government's leadership in this is something that we as an organization will do a little bit more work on. So our plan in the next 3 to 6 months is really actually to documenting how the Japanese firms and Japanese government work hand in hand to ensure the supply chain resilience. And then going back to Taiwan, at the firm level, based on the conversations that we have had with Taiwanese entrepreneurs, really two different strategies. One is you're not thinking, they are thinking about reducing productions, but for some companies, they really are thinking about adding new production sites outside of China. And then the second thing they are thinking is that they need to incorporate these sort of risk management into like highest level decision-making process. The reason for that is it's easy to talk about risk mitigation or to talk about supply chain diversification, but when it's in the implementation phase, it's really a slow and painful process. So the discussions that we have had, the entrepreneurs, they are looking for actually 4 different things. And then any new investment destinations will have to fit into these 4 criteria. One is, does it have sufficient supply of skilled labor? 2, do they have predictable political environment? So will there be a coup the next day? Will there be a conflict, next month, right? The third factor they're looking at is stable supply of electricity. 4th is, can the country or the investment destination accommodate a whole cluster of relocation? They cannot just move along. So when we think about Taiwanese economy, a lot of it, yes, it's semiconductor, but a lot of it is the so-called, 电子五个, the telecom, like big five, right? So then they need all the upstream, downstream suppliers, to all go with them. So not just semiconductor, the same thing, right? So, TSMC, all the other companies, they cannot just move along. They need the whole cluster to move with them. So that makes the whole relocation or nearshoring, friendshoring process very challenging because it could lead to, expensive production, and then it might potentially impact the productivity and competitiveness of these firms. So the government intervention and assistance, such as Taiwanese government's assistance, providing a lot of funds and support in the process is actually quite necessary. And Japanese government also provides corresponding fund to help supply the supply chain diversification process. So the last slide. So last slide, this is basically a question I want to pose to the audience. I know GTI's crowd usually, are kind of have defense expertise. So the reason why I want to show this is the first quarter of trade data coming out of China is that China's trade or China's export to Latin America, to Africa, to ASEAN have all increased by about 25 to 30% the first quarter. And so also you can see from this slide is that China's trade to global south has surpassed China's trade to US plus EU plus Japan. So I guess my question is that if we're thinking this from defense or security perspectives, what are the implications? Like, are we thinking about this holistically? Because this is not just an economic issue. This is not just, trade transactions. If we're really thinking this as a security and defense angle, then what are the implications for the rest of us? So I will stop here. So that's a question for our audience, and I hope to hear from you and learn more from you. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Patty, and I'm glad you let us talk about that question because it leads us really nicely into your fellow panelists' comments here. You've laid a great foundation, so I'm actually going to hand it over to our next panelist here, Rupert Hammond-Chambers. So Rupert is the president of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council, where he was elected vice president in 1998, president in 2000. So prior to 1994, he served as an associate for development at the Center for Security Policy, a defense and foreign policy think tank here in DC. He also serves as a managing director at Bauer Group Asia. Hammond-Chambers is an expert on Taiwanese political and economic issues with a special focus on defense and security. He is also a member of the board of the Project 2049 Institute and a member of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. He holds a BA from Denison University. So Rupert, take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. I think mostly if you draw a line between GTI, Project 2049 and USTBC, you'll capture most of the core of our community. Thank you to GTI for hosting this event, for including me today. It goes without saying, but it needs to be said nevertheless, that the quality of the work this organisation does is enormously important for those of us who focus our efforts exclusively on Taiwan and help to, I hope, educate and inform the broader community of the importance of America's relationship with Taiwan and Taiwan's centrality in the world. I think just what I would like to do in my allotted time is just touch on a couple of wee things that I think are interrelated. I made some obvious comments, then perhaps drill down and offer something that might be a bit more nuanced. I certainly take the position that the threat from China towards Taiwan is real. Okay, that's a fairly obvious statement. That's where I might deviate somewhat from some of the breathless coverage of the past couple of years is the imminence of an attack by China on Taiwan. I do not subscribe to that view. I do not intend to be cavalier about the threat from China. The Chinese are spending enormous quantities of natural resources on building up the People's Liberation Army and their capacity to project power. And I think that obviously is significant. But to me, at the moment anyway, the focus of their hard power is to underpin what they're doing in other areas. And in respect to Taiwan, I believe, to underpin a series of coercive actions and directions intended to pressure the Taiwan people into accepting a political arrangement on Beijing's terms without firing a missile or sending a ship or airplane into Taiwan's, in essence, fighting a whole war. From an economic standpoint, I think that is very much the tip of the spear. The intention of the Chinese through their military actions at the moment is both to improve the quality of their military and their ability to operate, to understand how they would necessarily be challenged by us, the Japanese, the Aussies, the Brits, and others, but also to place economic and political pressure on the people of Taiwan to maintain, indeed, to ratchet up when they feel like they have opportunities to do that, to create this impression of inevitability about an outcome. And that if they can continue to maintain that, indeed to expand it, they believe they can force Taiwan in a moment in the foreseeable future, medium to long term future, where Taiwan, I'll use the word, is forced into capitulation, and people on Taiwan move from a dynamic democracy into the grips of a belligerent totalitarian regime. Something right now. But we're here to talk about what the economic ramifications are, and they're real. When we think about comments recently by people like Musk, Buffett, when we think about important government leaders, they're important in their own right. Forgive me, I don't mean to suggest they're not. We think about important government leaders like Janet Yellen, Secretary Raimondo. They have all made comments that play to the pressure that the Chinese are applying on Taiwan. Potentially, I'm not suggesting that they are cooperating with the Chinese directly in any way, shape, or form. But when they talk about Taiwan being a dangerous place to do business, they play in the same pool that PRC is attempting to create, the same atmospherics that the Chinese are attempting to create. Somebody I respect deeply pointed out to me just recently that when Buffett made his comment about divesting his company, Berkshire Hathaway, from TSMC stock, which is doing extremely well right now, for those of you who might hold it, congratulations. But that Buffett was basically making the point that he sees Apple as a company, but he sees TSMC as a country. I'll leave you with that thought. Perhaps we can come back to it in our Q&A session. It's a very interesting observation, and I think a thread worth pulling on a wee bit. But nevertheless, across the economic sphere, outside of all, including all business sectors, outside of the defense sector, but that is a unique area of business in respect to engagement with Taiwan, we are seeing companies assess supply chain risk and how do they deal with it. Again, I would associate myself absolutely with those who say that decoupling is ridiculous and unfeasible. It's not. We're not going to decouple from China and Taiwan. We're too embedded there. But there is certainly much that can be done to de-risk, and that fits neatly, I think, more broadly, certainly in the Western world, with a resurgence in neo-industrial policy, with a much stronger role being played by the governments of Western countries. I'll stick there if you don't mind. Western countries in industrial policy, and we can look no further than the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not sure it did much to reduce inflation, but certainly the substance of the act is unquestionably industrial policy. And as with broad ramifications both for America's economy, but also our relationship with other countries as well, and trading blocs, in respect to the degree to which we're prioritizing our own economic and policy interests. So another suggestion I want to make to all of you in the next year, particularly in the run-up to next January's election, is that Mr. Musk and Buffett's and Yellen's and Raimondo's comments are simply going to be repeated by other voices. We've got an enormous now community of persons who are looking to participate actively in the issues surrounding Taiwan sovereignty and Taiwan's interests and how we necessarily deal with them. Jamie Dimon, I don't know if that name rings a bell to all of you, but he was weighing, we're going to see a lot of people, very smart people, most of them, weigh into this subject matter and offer up comments and thoughts that are going to ripple across our policy spectrum. and some won't have any impact, but some will. And they're going to cause anxiety, and they're going to even cause policy shifts. For the purposes of this point, they're going to cause anxiety in the crucible of Taiwan's general election and legislative elections in the run up to January. And then we're going to pivot right into our own general election here in the United States. And surely China and Taiwan policy are going to be central to any foreign policy, national security, and economic discussion the United States has about who we should elect as our next president. So, brace for that. I think we're going to see more of it. How much time do I have left? Okay. So if we dovetail into trade policy, so we've got this weight down, this pressure on Taiwan right now. Indeed, not just on Taiwan. I think let's broaden it out a wee bit. I think it's on the US-Taiwan economic relationship because we're bound together inexorably. Semiconductors, as was mentioned earlier, is an excellent example. But as also was mentioned earlier, it's not the only one. Taiwan's economy is broader than just chips, although that is certainly very central. Countries can step in and offer a counterweight by engaging in trade policy. We have at the moment the US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. It is one policy one trade mechanism or platform that we are pursuing, but there are others, EPPD, excuse me, TIFA and others, but that's the one that's up and running at the moment. It's attracting a great deal of attention. It's also creating attention, forgive me, it's also creating some interesting tension. For those of you that may have noticed, the House Ways and Means Committee had a vote this week. 42-0, it voted in favor of the US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade. And then I can see one video, but I could have, I just didn't choose to. To a man and woman who I did see or read about, they got up there and they were highly critical of the administration being proactive, playing offense on trade policy, making the point that, in one sense, that they support US-Taiwan economic engagement and the necessity of it, but in another, that it's Congress's remit to pursue trade agreements, and that the executive branch needs to be extremely careful to the degree in which it weighs in there. I am quite sympathetic, frankly, to the tensions between the congressional and executive branches over a division of power. You will all have your own views about executive authority, but I do think in this instance, it teases out very nicely the tension here between the absence in the states of a cohesive policy that Republicans and Democrats can support to 50+1, and a really extraordinary level of support now within the totality of America's political system for this country's relationship with Taiwan, and the degree to which we as a country are prepared to push forward and support Taiwan, even if it bumps up against parochial political interests like the tricky issues surrounding trade and how trade plays domestically here in the United States. So I like it. I think it very much fits with the position the US-Taiwan Business Council has been taking. And I'm going to reach a bit here, but again, perhaps we can get into it a wee bit in the Q&A, that in the absence of a cohesive set of trade priorities for the United States to present to the world and engage on, which would require congressional oversight and passage, perhaps there's an opportunity with Taiwan and what we're doing with Taiwan to create that consensus between enough Republicans and Democrats, initially with Taiwan, and then potentially to leave a template of priorities and policies that could be used in engaging other critical trading partners. Just a thought, but certainly one worth having. Couple more minutes, and then I'll wrap up. When we think about what the impact of this economic coercive policy is having on Taiwan, it's very real. I look at it in the audience today. I know there are a lot of you who are in and out of Taiwan often, and who have an acute, granular understanding of the country, of the tensions within its people, and within this election cycle, economic vulnerability is definitely being felt. And it's being played to by the PRC, but the US is playing in this pool as well. Our Chips and Science Act has caused considerable anxiety. So neo-industrial policy, parochially focused on the semiconductor industry, which is at the heart of Taiwan's economic miracle. Taiwan people, quite understandably, are extremely sensitive about any threat that may be represented to the loss of the centrality of that, the loss of its technology, and the people who participate in the research and development, and the industrial base supplies over now. The SEMI released its updated numbers this week. Over 60% of contract manufactured chips are now made by Taiwan businesses. Over 90% of high-end chips. And frankly, Taiwan is pulling away from Samsung now. I mean, it's TSMC, pardon me. Where there was parity 2 to 3 years ago, now as they push into 2 nanometer and producing at scale and even 1.4, TSMC now is beginning to open up some space between itself and its Korean competitor. So this tension within Taiwan is real. It's being felt by the people, and the pan-blue, the deep blue media and the Chinese are of course playing in that pool. They are absolutely digging at this sense of anxiety, and it does require a response from us. That response can come through government engagement interaction, such as involving in the Chips for Alliance, which is government driven, and other government platforms that allow Taiwan to participate and actively represent itself, to have agency in a way in which it allays some of those concerns. And then just my final point, it can also come with the way in which companies act. For those of you who may have recently tracked Jensen Huang's trip to NVIDIA, from NVIDIA to Taiwan, I mean, honestly, it was like Katy Perry's tour, it was just extraordinary. He was like an absolute rock star. He is a rock star in a different sense, so that is clear. But it was an extraordinary outpouring of support, not just for a returning son, if you'll excuse me for putting it in those terms, but for what NVIDIA represents, a company now worth over $1 trillion. Its intellectual property is enormously important in our lives today, and in my humble opinion, will only become more important as technologies like artificial intelligence become more part of our day-to-day activity. But Jensen, if we go back to the tooling event in Phoenix, Arizona last December 6th, where Jensen took the 5 minutes that he had to talk to the assembled people, including our president, Mr. Biden, he talked about trust. He talked about trust for 4 to 5 minutes. One word. That's all he focused on. It was brilliant. It was one of the best speeches I've heard. And it absolutely struck at the very core, the very nature of the technology relationship between the United States and Taiwan, that we would trust a partner so much that we would be prepared to take a business that's worth $1 trillion. And that $1 trillion is predicated on the intellectual property that business owns and has developed, and hand it to another company for production. The level of trust that's required for that is just extraordinary. And I think for me, it captures much more broadly, it's much more reflective of the nature of the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. These are two countries that trust each other implicitly. And while we do a great deal already, there is much still that we can do. But it requires parity, and it requires each to support each other. It requires the US to support Taiwan economically, both through government action and company action, and it requires Taiwan to support the United States in its own requirements, such as creating a broader industrial base in areas like the semiconductor industry. I'll stop there. Thank you all very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You've really given us a lot to discuss, Rupert, so I appreciate it. And I especially appreciate, you really hashing out the connections between national security and economic security, which is really central to what we're discussing today. I would say a perspective that we're somewhat missing in this conversation, we've already outlined it very well, provided a great foundation, is of course what's happening on the ground in Taiwan when it comes to what are entrepreneurs in Taiwan thinking, those looking to go abroad and those coming to Taiwan to set up shop. So in order to provide this perspective, I'm super excited to welcome David Chang, who is joining us all the way from Taiwan, Taipei, visiting us here in DC. So David is the founder and secretary general of Crossroads, which is an NGO in Taiwan that provides education, networking opportunities, and consulting to Taiwanese entrepreneurs looking to expand their business abroad, as well as international companies and individuals looking to set up shop in Taiwan. Chang is also the CEO and founder of WordCore, an online translation platform. Prior to his work at WordCore and Crossroads, David worked as the branch director for America Works of New Jersey, a legislative aide for New York State Senator, and a senior paralegal for Gilbert and Sackman. Having once described communication as the Achilles heel of Taiwan, Chang uses his positions to improve Taiwan's connection with the international community through translation and business. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from UC Santa Barbara. So David?
Thank you so much, Zoe. You guys hear it? Thank you. Oh, better. Thank you so much, Zoe, for the introduction. And it's a deep honor and privilege to be invited to today's event to speak and panel colleagues today. The two speakers before me introduced laid a great foundation for what I'm going to be talking about. My name is David Chang. I'm the Secretary General and founder of Crossroads. We're a nonprofit organization. It's officially registered 3 years ago, but our work stretches back 5 years. I've been living in town for 12 years already, and kind of very carefully observing the aspect of Taiwan's internationalization. From our definition of internationalization is how to make Taiwan a much more diverse and inclusive place for foreign entrepreneurs and talent. Taiwan is indeed at a crossroads as far as its relationship with the international community. Taiwan, since 3 years ago, since 2021, Taiwan has started declining its population. And by 2025, National Development Council has projected that Taiwan will become a super aged population by then, which meaning that more than 20% of its population will be 65 years and older. By 2041, the elderly population is expected to increase to 41%, which would cause, of course, a strong burden on economic development, as well as raise risks on national security as well. It shift, of course, economic development towards care of elderly. And of course, we're already starting to feel effects. On a January 2019 report, NBC released a report saying that 78% of employers in Taiwan are already feeling the talent shortage of talent, especially in sales, IT personnel, engineers, and it's already starting to feel the effects of this. So the question right now is, what is Taiwan's relationship with its own immigration community? What would it, if this is a phenomenon that's going around the world, especially in industrialized countries. It just has to do with shifting cultural values, priorities in family rearing, child rearing, on personal independence. And it doesn't seem like this trend will change anytime. So Taiwan is inevitably facing the pressing question: how are we going to establish a healthy environment for talent circulation? Which meaning from different stages of talent circulation, from attraction of talent, what is going to attract people to come to Taiwan in the first place? What are the immigration avenues? Number two is the retention part of it. What will have people stay? What are the career development opportunities? What will, if it's entrepreneurship, what is the ecosystem for startups, entrepreneurship in Taiwan? That is also the question. And the third part of it is actually including retention part is also integration. When foreign employees go there to Taiwan, are they feeling that this is actually something that they have a long-term life in Taiwan? Will they be viewed eventually after 10, 20, 30 years? Are they going to be viewed as part of the community or always seen as kind of separate from the community? These are all questions and issues that are needing to be tackled. And especially given Taiwan's diverse history, colonial history, even now, it's continuing the conversation discourse about what exactly is a Taiwanese national identity. It's very understandable that conversations about immigration and integration are difficult. It requires lots of time. It requires lots of soul searching, particularly given a very diverse and colonial history that Taiwan has. So with this said, we also have a very pressing geopolitical situation. And with anything with talent circulation, with population growth, any policies and programs will require time. The question is what's Taiwan's timeline look like right now? And how we can effectively have some programs that play to Taiwan's strengths and advantages as far as attracting talent. And seeing what we can work from there. But it'll also require a lot of political will, political courage, and also long-term thinking, strategizing as far as Taiwan policymakers. I will throw out a few kind of just to give an overall kind of view of the environment. Right now, as of the end of 2022, the total Taiwan population stands at around close to 23.3 million, with the total immigrant population of around 805,000 people, making up approximately only 3.4%, 3.46% of the entire population. Drawing from official statistics from the Ministry of Labor, around 725,000 immigrants are categorized as migrant laborers and caretakers, which makes up around 90.1% of the immigrant population and 3.1% of the entire Taiwan population. From that, we can mathematically deduce that white collar or so-called foreign professional population stands at less than 79,000 people, making up less than 9.9% of the entire immigrant population and less than 0.3% of the entire Taiwanese population. So and keep in mind, a majority of these white collar foreign professionals are actually comprised of English teachers. Not necessarily because that's their actual profession, but because the easiest path of immigrating and residing in Taiwan, working out of Taiwan, is to simply say, hey, I'm from an English-speaking country. I will be an English teacher and work out of a Bushiban or another class, and that's their way of taking up residing in Taiwan. So the question right now is, with such a tiny migrant population, what exactly is this relationship? Especially now that in last year, National Development Council Minister Kung also announced that we need to attract 400,000 immigrants in 10 years. How exactly are we going to do that? And even drawing from our experiences, looking at, and again, during the pandemic, we had an influx of immigrants, of high-level so-called talents, coming in through the gold card due to the pandemic. As probably many of you know in the room, Taiwan was, doing very well during the pandemic, attracted a lot of people seeking refuge from the COVID-19 pandemic. And people used the unemployment gold card program to come into the country. And, it was a very interesting moment because a lot of people who had no previous experience in Taiwan suddenly were experiencing and understanding Taiwan. And these are people from all over. But the ultimate question that was always looming in the back of our minds was, they're here, but are they going to stay? And that was always the question of what, through this interaction in Taiwan, what are their opportunities to stay? Are there resources, services that cater to their needs? And would they actually, find a life? Unfortunately, we were seeing a lot of statistics about people finding troubles with basic services like banking, with education services for their children, for families. They were finding, they're being put at the back of the list because they're foreigners to be able to enlist and enroll in education. Other kind of systemic issues right now that we are also dealing with right now are very basic kind of rights sometimes. One of the campaigns that we are launching, and we've launched since March, is a disability inclusion campaign. We've realized after kind of talking with many of our community members that if you're an immigrant in Taiwan and you become disabled mentally, physically, you do not actually have a right to get a disability certification, which is actual official recognition of your physical or mental disability. And especially now that Taiwan is also ramping up its own efforts to attract talent, and you also have an aging foreign population there. The question is right now is, where exactly does Taiwan stand with its relationship with its immigrant population? Are you going to be offering equal protection and access to social benefits, social services, or will there always be kind of a view that they are immigrants and there's, they can be kind of taken out and kind of, seen as, I hate to use this word, but kind of as second-class citizens. And even in our engagements with policymakers, legislators, control room members on issues like this and others, the common kind of rhetoric that we hear is, oh my gosh, we actually didn't know these things existed. It's amazing. Our actual image of foreign residents in Taiwan are people, having a great time and drinking at pubs all the time. We didn't know there are actually serious issues like, hey, you become disabled, you get hit by a car, you're aged, suddenly you're out of the system and you're told, and we've heard this from our community members, doctors seriously saying, sorry, but good luck. And these are some immigrants who've been there for 10, 20 years, started businesses there. And these are holes, and you can see because of this gap in the population, there is unfortunately, more bridges are certainly needed to engage. And Taiwan really needs to recognize. I mean, again, what are the political incentives of working and advocating for an immigrant, non-voting population? It's not, of course, on the brink of forward edges of everyone's minds. But at the same time, it's also thinking about Taiwan's long-term strategy and development. How are you going to create an environment that is accessible, and also very easier to navigate, especially given geopolitical concerns, risks. There's a lot of, disadvantages that Taiwan needs to actually improve on right now. And that is the question that is actually the ultimate purpose of Crossroads. We try to act as that communication channel, as the go-between between policymakers and the international community, and trying to fix the overall every step, providing solutions from talent circulation has to happen all at once. It has to happen from attraction, retention, to cultivation. How does it all tie into one picture to allow people to go in and basically prosper and thrive in buildings harmoniously? So I will stop there. I would be more than happy to share about a lot of other initiatives that we're working on in our question and answer session too. But yeah, Taiwan is an exciting place to be. If you guys are anytime welcome to come to Taiwan, I will be there. Feel free.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. It's a lot of these, what can be insanely bureaucratic issues that are also at the root of when it comes to Taiwan's internationalization of its businesses. That can be a huge challenge. So thank you for outlining those for us. Well, we're going to dive right into our moderated discussion for a moment. And I'd like to actually begin with the question that's quite general, but I think it's essential to maybe our listeners here and those at home to truly understanding where Taiwan is at when it comes to internationalizing its private enterprises, its private sector, some of the challenges that lie ahead here. So the question is basically, when it comes to Taiwan's economic security, is a more globalized Taiwan a more economically secure one? What are the challenges that comes with internationalizing its private sector? So I'd like to hear from each of your own perspectives. What do you think of that?
I can start. I think I really have a lot of admiration for Taiwanese entrepreneurs. And I think if you look at Taiwan's economy compared to Japanese and Koreans, like the traditional, East Asian like tigers, I think Taiwan's economy really truly is small and medium prices driven. So the majority of Taiwanese businesses are SMEs. That really has contributed so significantly to Taiwan's more inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Like when you go to Taiwan, the Gini inequality is so low, like the lowest throughout Asia, really. So I really attribute a lot to this very dynamic and diverse and very equitable kind of economic structure. At the same time, because it's SME dominant, it's a little bit harder for Taiwanese businesses to have these sort of bigger scale overseas investments. And because some of them is investment in capital intensive. When you go to a new country, so for instance, the electronics companies, when they're looking for new investment destinations, they're looking at India, Mexico, Northern Vietnam, Southeast Asia. They have to navigate a lot of local hurdles. It could be regulatory, very burdensome dozens of different permits they have to get. We hear that all the time, even from our own, private sector partners throughout the region. And then so when you coming from Taiwan, it's a brand new environment, it's very difficult. Language could be an issue, regulatory understanding could be an issue, compliance could be another issue. So all these becomes really like Hercules tasks for individual companies to overcome. So I think Taiwanese business associations, especially industry association, could actually play a bigger role. And I think they are doing that. And then to kind of organize and facilitate these sort of, larger investments, overseas. So, yeah, I see that both as a kind of advantage, but also at the same time, it's a little bit disadvantage, of Taiwanese, businesses when they are trying to, pursue new overseas, adventures.
So as far as internationalization, what I would like to focus on, of course, is talent circulation, this aspect of it. You mentioned obstacles, and I think I probably briefly mentioned it in my opening remarks. Overall, the biggest problems right now, of course, are policymakers seeing immigrants as not necessarily the most politically appetizing topic. Again, immigrants are a population that have no political rights. And of course, with a very nervous economic environment, something saying you're opening up the borders to get more people to potentially compete for jobs is always frightening. It's not just a Taiwan issue as well. So as much as there's a longer term strategy for the country to attract more talents, to make it more friendly, as far as the actual implementation of it, sometimes you'll find a lot of government agencies dragging their feet. And to see, and one of our biggest kind of our challenges as Crossroads is always to find out where the pressure points are. What legislators or allies we can work with to provide the proper pressure to say, look, there's a national strategy at work. How can we actually, work together on this together? I also like to say that one of the biggest challenges as far as just people, I say half seriously, and sometimes that there's actually a thin line between internationalization and colonialization among the concept. Basically, the sense that you'll find resistance to it, because if you ask any Taiwanese professional or person in Taiwan, you say, what do you think about Taiwan's future as a more international player? No one will say no. They say yes, internationalization is great. 国际化, you hear this concept quite a bit. But how to get there? What exactly it means? That's where the definition sometimes can fall differently. I think in the majority of time people you speak to and you say 国际化, they think of it as a means to make more money. As far as first and foremost. But as far as making Taiwan a more diverse place, we'll have general agreement to that, but how? That falls into the wayside. And exactly about, attracting people to come here and work. And then all of a sudden, what is their role down the line? Are they going to become citizens? Are they becoming long-term? These are questions that will require a lot of time, a lot of consideration about this. But until these kind of questions start, having some type of discourse around this, and solving these kind of issues about integration, it needs to happen. As far as entrepreneurship, why we are also asking for promoting a more international environment is how it can really benefit as an island. Again, with such a small migrant population, foreign residents provide just like in the US's example, immigration provides a lot more international connections, resources, people, the ability to reach out and to connect to international markets. You need these types of connections with the rest of the world. Foreign residents can also act as informal ambassadors, representatives, markets, people who talk about Taiwan. And to make it much more accessible in that sense is definitely a great thing for Taiwan. And learning about it. And again, you'll constantly hear from Taiwanese folks about, going abroad, working overseas, that's only for people who are rich. These people with families with resources. But if you can bring people to Taiwan, and give them more perspectives and, less of a barrier to talk to people from different cultures, I think that really begins from a very human level about how you start internationalizing Taiwan. Because right now, yeah, it's a huge barrier for most people to think about even working overseas, going overseas, or even starting companies that have an international effect, or impact international markets. Hey, speaking English to someone is already something that's cause for cold sweats about people, from general public. So, how to make this more familiar, more an environment that is already starting to cultivate talents who are more at ease with people from the national community. I think that's a longer term strategy that Taiwan needs to be thinking about. Yeah, sorry. I'll start there.
There's a tension, I think, in this question. In one sense, you'll find a few economies in the world more internationalized than Taiwan. That I think is very much specific to the technology community, where, that not surprisingly, there are few global barriers and boundaries towards the free exchange of goods, people, to make that all take. However, like many countries, Taiwan also has a fairly thick parochial streak to it, and that can manifest itself in its economy as well. Parochial interests, commercial interests, but also they're somewhat driven by, or are driven by, Taiwan's political isolation. I think that the financial community is an excellent example of this. Taiwan's financial community continues to underperform. Indeed, my entire career, I can remember government after government talking about the necessity to merge the banks, to internationalize the financial community, to provide a better financial environment for the very persons that David was citing, to encourage to come to Taiwan. It's incredibly difficult to come to Taiwan and get a credit card, open a bank account. It really is. It's not easy. And these are very basic tasks. If you're trying to persuade a young professional or a young family to come and live and work on the island and participate and contribute to the economic, cultural, and political welfare of its people, these things have to be smoothed out. And there's a lot of chatter each time we get new governments, but they go nowhere. And I think, in fairness, part of it relates to the fact that if Taiwan were ever to enter a financial crisis, who would bail them out? They're not part of any of the large financial institutions like the IMF that regularly roll out to bail out countries that chronically underperform or mismanage their finances. Taiwan would be on its own, and guess who would take advantage of that? 100%. It could even be an existential crisis. So managing at a very conservative level, we have the governor of the Central Bank of China, CBC, that's Taiwan Central Bank. I'm sure you all know that, but nevertheless. They would pitch a very conservative vision for how Taiwan should operate in the financial community. But it is a tension with the necessity of the country, as David Catherine so eloquently pointed out, to internationalize across the board. The more international Taiwan is, the more integrated Taiwan is into the global community. I personally believe the more likely it is, the less likely it is the Chinese will attack, because the rest of the world will be that much more vested in peace and security in Taiwan Strait and the economic welfare of the people on the island. But one final thought of all of this, that requires political courage on the part of the rest of the world to include Taiwan in these institutions that the rest of the world benefit from. If we're going to encourage and even press Taiwan to go down this path, there has to be room for Taiwan in organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and others. I don't know what that looks like, but there has to be some sort of formal arrangement that provides the Taiwan people with the kind of economic security they need to ensure that, if, God forbid, there is some sort of existential financial crisis on the island, it does not turn into an existential political crisis for the island people.
Excellent. All great points. Thank you all so much for highlighting how these are challenges on every level, truly. So I really appreciate all of your comments. Kind of going off of something that Catherine, you mentioned in your presentation at the very beginning. We talk about China's economic coercion of not only Taiwan, but countries throughout the world. And my question for this is, when it comes to Taiwan's private enterprises, what role do they play in mitigating any sort of economic coercion from China? And what does it look like when policy includes, the wills of private enterprises? What role do they play in policy making when it comes to that as well?
I think that pointed out a very difficult and challenging position that enterprises usually have, is like they don't have a lot of say over what China could do, because China usually employs these sort of tactics unilaterally. So whenever China perceives that the threat is as a direct attack to China's core interest, before it's about territorial disputes or territorial integrity. Now it could be anything and everything that goes against its leadership's preference or will, right? So like even in the case of say Australia a couple of years ago, like they're calling folk to kind of look into the bottom of the origin of the COVID-19, even that would cost the sanction from China. So I think it's a little bit harder to say because of the power imbalance between China versus like other countries or versus companies that have to kind of maintain a relationship. So I think that sort of power imbalance is just putting private enterprise into a very challenging position. But in terms of like what countries can do, I think one is, and companies as well, one is increasing the awareness, like just to kind of understand mapping out your supply chain and to see really how vulnerable you are. I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to Chinese companies, not just Taiwanese, to be fair, a lot of companies, they actually do not really know how vulnerable they are directly, indirectly. So I think first is like understanding kind of really the risks. So that's why I think government leadership is actually quite important. So in this case, going back to the case about Japan, so the economic security legislation, when it was first introduced, private sector was also at loss. Like, how do we even comply? Like, can we get more clarification? And we have more like public-private dialogue to really understand what the government wants from us. But then over time, I think the clarification, the dialogue, the persuasion from the government side, everything kind of trickled down. And then so you started to see companies like Mitsubishi, Fujitsu, Suntory, they started to establish units within their corporations, like economic security units. They also created positions like chief, supply chain risk officer or chief strategy officer, positions like that, to really making sure that they are one in compliance with their own law, to better understand the risk exposure they have. So I think this is why we're having this discussion, because I think in general, the awareness of, the exposure should be there and should be more discussed. And then two is, in the end of the day, we're in a very interconnected world. So when people are talking about, trading blocks, trading systems, so what choices and options we have after we realize the exposure, right? So then I think at that point, then we can really think more proactively, how do we pursue different, say, trading blocks, trading route, different supply chain block, whatever. But we need to understand really, the mapping first.
Excellent points. Thank you so much. I'd like to move on to something you mentioned, Rupert, actually during your presentation as well. It's kind of the role of the United States in all this. Last week, the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan, published their 2023 white paper, which among other things recommended, a series of reforms for Washington, to boost the bilateral business exchange between Taiwan and the United States, of which including, passing the taxation agreement, as well as continuing negotiations under the current 21st Century Trade Initiative. So, in your opinion, is the United States doing enough to boost the internationalization of Taiwan's businesses? And kind of what are the challenges that lie ahead in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship in that way?
Well, yes, thank you. It's a super question. I think, again, it depends on whose responsibility you think it is to boost Taiwan's participation. If we're talking about as a matter of government policy, I think post 2017 and the election of Mr. Trump and the shift in China policy, the bipartisan shift in China policy from accommodationist to realist, we have gathered momentum in respect to how we assess our interests with Taiwan from a government to government standpoint. I think there's a great deal that still needs to be done. I think we are now in a permissive environment. I mean, we're now in a permissive environment in respect to Taiwan to American policy with Taiwan. That is terrific. For those of us who've been doing this a wee while, we know what a non-permissive environment looks like. It's hard, very, very hard to make progress. So Mr. Biden's government and Mr. Trump's government prior to both sought ways to expand America's relationship with Taiwan in the security realm, of course, to address the imbalance in the defense relationship between Taiwan and China, to bolster Taiwan's defense, and to mobilize our own forces as well as our friends and allies in the region. Excellent, most needed, but also economically. But that's almost harder, candidly, even with all the resources we expend on national security, however you determine that. The parochial interests of a country's economy can get in the way of national security interests with other countries. And I sort of touched on that a wee bit when I talked about the Ways and Means vote. I really do think I really encourage you all to keep a close eye on what's going on in Congress in respect to economic relations, because I do think increasingly what we're seeing is that tension. You've got this extraordinary support across the board for our relationship with Taiwan. Absolutely focusing in on Taiwan's importance in of itself, not as a subset of China. Gosh, all of us, let's really try and move those apart so we can have proper conversations about national interest with Taiwan, not defer to China always in these discussions. There's a lot to be said there, but also we have the cauldron of American economic policy as a subset of the overall politics of our country, and trade policy is not seen in a positive realm. And I think we're going to struggle as ambition increases in the economic realm from a government standpoint. Watch the tax agreement, right? We've got Mr. Menendez's language out there as a precursor. There are absolutely rumblings at state and treasury about the possibility of a tax agreement of some kind between us and Taiwan. That will require congressional it will require oversight, it will communication, it will require discussion and debate, and ultimately passage if we can get to that point in time. That's going to be a big lift, a valuable and important one, but nevertheless a big lift. I think on the business to business side, there's a lot to be excited about. There really, really is. For all my point about the downward economic pressure that the communists are applying to Taiwan, the fact of the matter is that businesses like Google and Nvidia and Lam and Applied and I mean, gosh, across the board, we can pluck out the world's leading technology companies, and they are not reducing their economic engagement with Taiwan. They're increasing it. They are doubling down, and that is encouraging. That is a positive, both for the people of Taiwan, but also for the nature of the relationship between us here in the States and Taiwan as a critical partner and ally.
Great, thank you, and I appreciate the optimism when it comes.
You'll always get that.
I'd like to finish. I have one more question for our panelists here, and then we'll open up to audience Q&A. Just a reminder for those at home, we are accepting questions online as well. You can submit it into the chat, or you can tweet us at Global Taiwan, or send it to contact@globaltaiwan.org. So my final question here is for you, David. And it's about, data showing that Taiwanese people working in China, the number of them has actually steadily decreased since 2014. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on, has this been coupled with a return to Taiwan? Tech talent or other forms of, high-level talent, Taiwanese returning to Taiwan? If not, what does the future look like for talent flow?
Well, as far as people, the less people going to China, there is definitely across the board. We actually have people from our community who used to live in China decided over the last few years that China is no longer the place it used to be. They came back to Taiwan, whether they're foreigners or whether they're Taiwanese, but really kind of seeing. But let me rewind a little bit. With Taiwanese entrepreneurs, I think there are those who have the ambition to look at China probably are looking at other places. That's the thing is, for ambitious entrepreneurs or people who are looking on the world, they're probably already looking because they don't see Taiwan as a place where they can necessarily develop. So they're looking at places overseas. As far as foreign entrepreneurs and come to Taiwan. Sorry, can you repeat the question again? Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just think that it's really interesting that there used to be a lot of reports in the early 2010s about Taiwan's brain drain, right? And that the main beneficiary was China. So many of them were going to China. Seeing as this is kind of no longer the case, it's been steadily decreasing. Where are Taiwanese entrepreneurs going? And what are, I guess from your perspective would be really great. What are some ways that Taiwan can kind of mitigate that, bring that talent back to Taiwan?
I think overall, those who, again, for Taiwanese entrepreneurs looking to go overseas, I think we've been hearing a lot. Again, our focus is only on talent coming in. But as far as Taiwan entrepreneurs going overseas, we do hear a lot coming, seeking opportunities in the States as well as Southeast Asia. Part of the, probably part of the, southbound policy. There's been a lot of exploration of that part. As far as attracting them back to Taiwan, again, the market isn't huge. That's one of the concepts we hear about Taiwan as a place where entrepreneurs should start. For foreign entrepreneurs starting a business in Taiwan, is usually we hear cheap labor. We hear about engineering talent, technical talent, especially if you're a tech startup. It's a great place to find really great engineers at probably a third salary wage. That's been the number one kind of what we've been hearing from entrepreneurs in Taiwan about setting up in Taiwan. Again, but that's also layered with difficulties in banking, difficulties in financial services, as well as also work culture differences as well. Working with Taiwanese staff and employees requires an understanding of their work culture, which is definitely tends to be much more instructional based. I don't know a better way of putting it, but kind of rather than having to manage something, but basically you have to give them very strict instructions about what to do. Which, for the most part, I think with the tech entrepreneurs that we deal with, that works perfectly for them at times. So that's just some of the challenges and obstacles that we see.
Great, I very much appreciate that insight. So we're now going to open up to audience questions. So we actually have a mic that can be brought around. So please state your name, your affiliation, and your question.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. To be honest, if China wants to invade using nothing more than baseball bats, they could win. They're willing to sacrifice enough violence. I am less sanguine about the potential for the invasion being postponed for long periods of time. And the reason for that is because all our intelligence tells us that this is Xi Jinping's number one desire. He wants credit reuniting China. My problem is we have a lot of magical thinking about how prepared Taiwan is for this invasion. They'll probably wait for hydropower to recover in China. They'll wait for more COVID effects to disappear, and they'll probably wait for the inevitable real estate collapse to be bypassed. But after that, 5 years down the road, maybe we've got vulnerability. We have zero indication. 5 years from now, Taiwan will have more weapons than Ukraine preparing for that invasion. And there's no convoys coming from Poland to Taiwan. So guys, you gotta wake up. If you want weapons, you're gonna have to manufacture them. And I'm asking if the private enterprises are in any way prepared to make the torpedoes, to make the anti-ship missiles, to make the drones that might sink the invasion. Because that is the only way in which Taiwan survives, is to sink the invasion fleet.
Any responses on Taiwan's indigenous weapons manufacturing? Or I know, Catherine, you mentioned before in your writings quite a bit about energy being another major concern if there is a cross-strait contingency. So if you'd like to elaborate on that as well.
I'm definitely not like a defense expert, so I would try. I think that's a great question. Based on what we heard, it's not going to be, I mean, like we consulted as some defense experts in Taiwan as well, here in the US. The consensus we've heard is that it's not going to be like a full-on assault or invasion, because Taiwan doesn't really have the beach for them to even land. So it's going to be essentially kind of a blockade situation. And so these are kind of experts' opinions. So I'm just repeating what the results of our consultations are. And on top of that, I think energy is really a top concern, because Taiwan's liquefied natural gas only has about like 10, 12 days, at most 14 days reserve. And so, once the blockade is posed, then how long Taiwan can really go on without energy. So that really is kind of the top concern I've heard. And I welcome other experts.
Well, I would quibble with you that China coming across the strait with baseball bats would win. Or the apples and oranges comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan. They're very different situations. As to whether or not Taiwan has a domestic defense industry, it does. It's primarily run through the Zhongshan Institute in Taoyuan County, where they produce at volume Xiongfeng 2 and Xiongfeng 3 missiles. Those are anti-ship and cruise missiles, but they do have significant domestic capabilities, and also significant cooperation with US defense companies, building up domestic capabilities, as well as helping them purchase and integrate platforms and systems that they procure from the rest of the world. It is a race against time, for sure, to maintain a balance of power in the strait. And the fact of the matter is, in the continued era, hopefully ending, of strategic ambiguity, Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense can only ultimately rely on itself in respect to any of the contingencies that we might come up with that threaten Taiwan's sovereignty. I do believe that the US and Japan would be there, but that's not something that Taiwan can take for certain. They have to maintain their own effort. One other quick thought: it is the policy position of the two main parties, the Kuomintang and the Democratic Progressive Party, to continue to build up domestic defense industry, both the legacy companies that they have, as well as to encourage their significant technology base to enter and participate in providing Taiwan with capabilities, not just in the hard power area, but also cyber and others.
I can, I just want to add something here. So this is just my personal opinion. So not with site. I think the threat coming from PRC, it's information warfare. I think that really is the most concerning part. When I follow Taiwanese news, I see a lot of politicians will just retweet something, repeat something, and it's just without even thinking through some of the consequences. So I see that as a more of a threat to Taiwan's democracy and then to really undermine people's confidence in its own political and economic systems and more than like really yes, like, all the security defense stuff is super important as well. I definitely recognize that. But I think really on like the human level, the societal level, is that the information infiltration that worries me the most.
So thank you both. Do we have any other questions from our audience members here? Yes.
In 17 years at Taiwan Semiconductors. Well, I was just in Taipei last month. Because most of them, the business school. My question is, what should Taiwanese companies do more to help America? Because the consensus is Taiwan is fine. It has been, is always is a very resilient. Taiwanese companies manage to solve problems and they're doing it in spite of its fact being absent of organizations. Because of so that's another matter. But I think the question is, how can Taiwanese companies do more to help the American companies and also the American government and its new endeavor and its new industrial policy? IRA, bilateral infrastructure act, chips, science in America. Americans got problems, big ones. Number one, workforce development. Not enough STEM engineers in America. Okay, then you have a lot of Taiwanese tech companies used to hiring the best engineers, but here it's hard. Number two, manufacturing. There is not almost okay. It's not just building the factories. Engineering folks to run the factories at a cost-effective and time-delivered basis. Someone has all of that in space. That's why you have a lot more companies. My question is, how should Taiwanese companies, being a transnational private enterprise, help the American private sector and also government and succeed economically so that one's future can depend on the US future? Because if you look at the peak of America.
Any responses to that?
Okay, sure. I'll just have I'll start quickly. To answer the question, and another excellent question. I would point to the systems integrators. Let's take Foxconn because it's the best example. If you look at what's going on here with the rollout of environmental policies and how they're driving electrification, we're obviously at a very early stage in all of that. But look at what Foxconn is doing in respect to creating common platform. I think I would argue that as time progresses, we're going to get increasingly used to buying vehicles that are Apple branded vehicles, Google branded vehicles with operating systems where the software looks more like this than it does in the cars that we have at the moment, where there's very basic software. Think about Apple CarPlay, the very basic example, and it certainly reflects my point. Where a company like Foxconn goes, with its supply chain, as opposed to the legacy supply chain that automobile industries have. It's totally different. If you look at Tesla's supply chain as opposed to GM's supply chain, they're apples, they're black and white in difference. Of course, you know this very well. Importantly, Tesla's supply chain runs through Taiwan, GM's supply chain does not. So the technology infrastructure that comes with the supply chain and the clustering that comes around the systems integrators is it has hugely important ramifications for economies. It helps economies evolve and gravitate from where they are now into where they need to be to handle the next big set of opportunities. It helps in educating the workforce. I absolutely agree with your point about STEM. We could do, maybe GTI could do a session. David's job is so important in respect to Taiwan's long-term health and well-being, getting immigration right, so that the country has an expanding workforce and a population to support its older people from a well-being standpoint, as well as the economic, political, and security environment ongoing. But the systems integrators for me are really important. Foxconn is obviously in Taiwan and China. It is in India now. It's done a deal with Saudis. Europe, TBD. I think the Europeans, if there are any in the audience right now, it's a big opportunity for you to attract a company like Foxconn and have them start to set up their ecosystem. So anyway, I love the question. I think there's a lot there we could really dive into, but I'm sure my colleagues on the panel have other thoughts.
So we completely agree with you. That's basically echo what our conversation with the Taiwanese entrepreneurs, especially in the semiconductor industry. They share the same comments and concerns you have, because, for instance, when TSMC moved to Arizona, it cannot just be one company, right? So it has to move the whole cluster. But then there's energy issue, there's water issue, there's talent issues, there's labor regulation issues, right? So it's really a whole set of challenges that we just have to kind of take both sides and multiple stakeholders to work them out.
Yes, thank you both. I would be interested to see how it plays out with a bunch of political science majors talking about STEM, but we can definitely. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Rupert, I'd like to hear anything good about NVIDIA. I just bought a share of stock yesterday, so I hopefully everything's going well. Not a lot of money, don't worry, but I know David kind of touched on this. This is such a really interesting question about the issues with sort of internationalization that Taiwanese companies are facing. And I know you talked about some of the issues that Taiwanese companies are facing in Taiwan, or just issues in Taiwan. What sort of immigrants, like how are they going to be treated? What are their standards? Analysts have talked a lot about cultural discrepancies. And just preface, I might trash American culture just a little bit, but there's a lot of articles about TSMC has talked about these difficulties, how Taiwanese people have a lot of they take a lot of pride in their work, and they sort of just they're really like they take initiative and they're always trying to help. And TSMC has found that when they come to America, they found that sometimes Americans sort of question orders more. They complain a little bit more. And I would think that this is sort of like a microcosm of like a larger problem of sort of when you go abroad, how do you deal with those kind of cultural discrepancies, especially needs to be hard work. So if the panelists have anything to say about that, I'd love to hear it.
That's a great question. One of the things I also like to talk about my experiences in Taiwan, because I grew up in the US. We went back 12 years ago. Very key thing, and especially something my parents always say, is that in Eastern culture, you're kind of taught how to listen. Listen, scope the room, know your role, and speak only when spoken to, or know, time's right. Whereas in Western culture, as we all know, we're encouraged to speak up and express our opinions. The more you express, the more you prove your value. So there's a very different spectrum as far as how you apply to a business, a company, an organization. It's definitely creates a lot of differences in how work culture, work structure, how companies are run. It creates big discrepancies on this part. So a lot of people from our community, foreigners who made the skip from English teacher, perhaps their job, are still reporting a lot of difficulties and adjusting, especially those who probably have trouble or haven't been able to pick up Chinese, learning it. And even if they do, they're usually seen in a company as kind of like, okay, well, listen to instructions, don't speak up when the boss is speaking. If you do, people probably, give you an eye. And this, of course, causes some type of kind of differences in how people work together in these types. So work culture is definitely a huge factor in how people feel like they will be able to stay in Taiwan long term. They might do it, they might see, think about Taiwan as a place, but during this time, we've had lots of people going through this, what we call the revolving door of Taiwan. Very high talent people trying their best to fit into kind of the work culture. But others succeeding, not everyone, I'm not, again, being optimistic, trying to awesome. There are people who do succeed. They find it, they do integrate. But for the most part, especially those coming from an American culture background, this is not something that they really feel like they can stomach for, let's say, 20, 30 years of their career. And constantly feeling also there's also certain barriers to career development, being the foreigner in the group. Also, as far as kind of going into work expectations, dealing with suddenly overtime, unpaid overtime, constantly every day, being relegated to suddenly becoming the English consultant or translator suddenly, even though it wasn't in their job description. So a lot of differences kind of in how, people can feel, and this is something that probably won't change. Let's not expect change in how company work culture. That's not going to change anytime. What we're looking at as far as solutions right now is how do you create an environment where people can come, introduce new ideas and resources, and create new jobs, create new models, so that people can exchange and people can also understand, okay, this company does it different. But there's also models that we can learn from. Their employees perhaps are working 40 hours a week, somehow getting off work early, but they are still an effective and efficient company. Maybe there's something to be said about that. That's how culture changes. You have to have models, you have to have things that improve themselves, and that this requires time. So it's preeminently important to have this talent circulation flow. You need new people, new models, new ideas, new drivers, new job creators to really start changing that culture. And that's how we're looking at it too. And also the other factor is education. I cautiously put out there that the Taiwanese traditional education system is very unique. Well, it's not very unique. It's a system that's kind of like a factory line for accounting, the way it's structured. You take tests, you're standardized, you're expected to memorize, and then you take a test, see how well you do, and then so on. And your major in college or university is defined for you, and that's basically where you're going to go. And it very is much a factory line of assembling talent. And that is also reflected in the kind of work that you see in Taiwan. Now, I'm happy to say over the last few years, experimental education is also a field that's being talked about. There's more and more loosening up on experimental education. This is also a field that we're working on. And we're exploring ways of also trying to get the foreign community involved. How do you build engagement in the education system? And through public school systems or private school, you need to insert international perspectives, diverse perspectives into the system. The question is, how do you do it? What are the most, best ways of doing it? Now we're talking about the Bilingual 2030 initiative. Everyone probably familiar with it. The English raise national levels of English proficiency and accessibility. Boy, there's a lot of resistance because there's a lot of anxiety from teachers, school administrators. Like, how do you inject this suddenly, these foreigners or English teaching and curriculum into the public education system? There's a lot of fear about job security, anxiety, how do you change the curriculum, how well they can do this? And these are all very understandable. So there's a lot of questions about implementation, execution, and how you can get more people from diverse communities involved in curriculum teaching without shaking up too much of the existing system. I think that's the biggest challenge right now with the bilingual initiative.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to all of our panelists today. Please join me in And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy for sponsoring today's event. Please grab something to eat. Please go for a bagel and hang out. Thank you again for joining us.